Good morning, Mr. Mellor.
Good morning, sir.
Let me explain the arrangement. You're talking not just to the large group of people here at Aldwych House in central London.
Yes, I'm glad we've attracted a crowd. This is always good to know.
And to the press who are at the back.
Yes,
and to the lawyers who are on your left.
Yes.
But you're also talking to a considerable number, numbered in 3 figures, I have no doubt, who will be watching online.
Okay.
And what you say is always recorded visually and in audio form for posterity. Mr. Hill will ask you the questions in a moment once Mary has invited you to take the oath. Mary.
Please state your full name.
David John Mellor.
Take the book
You want
in
me
your...
to stand?
As you wish.
Take an oath, we'll stand, yes.
Take the book in your raised hand
Yeah.
and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and
the
nothing
truth.
but the truth. Thank you.
Mr. Hill.
Mr. Mellor, can I begin by just taking a quick whistle-stop tour through your career? You say in your statement that you provided to the inquiry that you read law at Cambridge University and were called to the bar in 1972.
I did, yes.
Is it right that by the end of your time practicing at the bar, the bulk of your practice was in industrial relations?
It was, yes.
You were elected MP for Putney in 1979 at the beginning of the Thatcher government, is that right?
That's it.
And if we could have on screen, please, WITN 7068001, page 5. This is your statement, in paragraph 1.4 of your statement, where you provide a list of the posts that you held in government. And we can see there it began on the 15th of September 1981, when you were appointed as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department of Energy. You moved in January 1983 to the equivalent post at the Home Office.
Mm-hmm.
In September 1983, you were promoted to Minister of State at the Home Office. Then on the 13th of June 1987 to the 26th of July 1988, you were Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. 25th of July 1988 to the 27th of October 1989, the Minister of State at the Department of Health.
Yes.
That will be the focus of the first set of questions for you. In October 1989, you left the Department of Health and returned to the Home Office as Minister of State, remaining there until the 22nd of July 1990. On that date, you were appointed as Minister of the Privy Council Office for Arts, 28th of November until the 28th of November 1990, and on that date you became Chief Secretary to the Treasury, a post that you retained until the 9th of April 1992, when you became Secretary of State at the Department of National Heritage.
Yeah.
Turning then to the first of those 2 areas which are going to be of particular interest to us, Minister of State at the Home Office and Chief Secretary to the Treasury. July 1988, which is when you became Minister of State at the Department of Health, the department itself had just been established at that stage, hadn't it? The old DHSS having been split in 2. And Kenneth Clarke had been appointed as Secretary of State at the same time as you. Is it right that you succeeded Tony Newton as Minister of State for Health?
Well, he was more, I think he was Social Security, but it was during the amalgamation. But yes, I took on the responsibilities relevant to this, yes.
Your permanent Under-Secretaries of State, so the more junior ministers to you in the House of Commons, were first of all Edwina Currie, to December 1988.
Indeed, yes.
She resigned in December 1988 following comments about salmonella and eggs, I believe. Then she was replaced by Roger Freeman. Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
And in the House of Lords, Lord Trafford.
Yes, who sadly died in office, yes.
That was in September 1989.
Yes.
And so really just before you moved on from the Department of Health
Yes.
and moved back to the Home Office. And is it right that throughout your time at the Department of Health, the permanent secretary was Sir Christopher France?
Yes, although I had very little to do with him, actually. The person that I had most to do with was Donald Atchison, and I'm the Chief Medical Officer, and I'm sorry that he's no longer with us, because he was a first-class man, and I spent a lot of time in his company. I didn't really have much need of the services of the Permanent Secretary, but I had plenty of need of the services of Donald Atchison, because so much of what we were dealing with was highly technical issues about, for instance, the spread of AIDS, which was, well, beset with problems and to a degree remains so.
I'll come back to both your relationship with Donald Atchison and also the question of your role in dealing with AIDS.
Yeah.
But before I do, could I just ask you to give us a more general overview of what the role of Minister of State at the Department of Health involved?
Right. Well, I was asked, Ken Clarke wanted me to go back and help him primarily. I should say, by the way, Ken Clarke was, is, and remains a very dear friend of mine. And he wanted me to come back and help him with what was the major work that we had to do, which was Mrs. Thatcher's desire to reform the health service. And that was really why I was there. But obviously there were other things that I had to do. Responsibility for AIDS was a natural continuation of a subject I'd become very interested in when I was at the Home Office, which was illegal drugs, and the problems, of course, of illegal drugs and the spread of AIDS. So I did that, and I also, little things like the Children's Act, which was a long piece of legislation, fortunately not one that required any much policy work, but it did require taking through Parliament. That, I think, became law in November of '89, but effectively I'd done all the work on that. I say that not to sort of boast about how active I was in those days, not any longer, but in those days how active I was. But it's because it was, people sometimes assume that ministers have nothing to do except do one thing. And of course the problem with being a minister in a department like that, and even more so when we get to the time of the Treasury, there is just so much to do. You have to ration your time quite carefully, but also be very selective about what you look at and what you don't look at in terms of what you want to get personally involved in. But in relation to infected blood, I was not responsible for that. That fell under Mrs. Curry's bailiwick. But I was interested in the subject because, obviously, of my interest in AIDS, but also what an awful thing. I mean, AIDS was awful. I mean, we'll come on to this, no doubt, but seeing people who are dying of AIDS is, I'll never forget it in the whole of my life. And I used to do a few visits with Princess Diana, and she was wonderful with them. I can never think ill of her because she was really amazing. But the point about what has happened with the blood contamination problem is that I just felt it was an extraordinarily cruel fate that people who had already had the imposition of a very, very difficult condition to deal with, haemophilia, should then, because of things that they were given in an attempt to make their life easier, should then also be contaminated with AIDS. And I just thought of the many horrible things that one comes across doing the sort of jobs that I was doing in government. That's one of the very worst. And so outside of my formal brief, I used to take an interest in it because I thought it was worthy of taking an interest in, and I still do.
How soon after you got to the Department of Health were you made aware of the issue of people with haemophilia in particular having been infected with HIV?
Right, give me that again.
How soon after you reached the Department of Health were you made aware of the issue about people with haemophilia being infected
I can't
with
remember
HIV?
exactly when it was, but obviously quite soon after. But exactly when it was, no, I can't remember.
Just going back to some structural questions about the Minister of State for Health. How much independence did you have to make decisions on policy areas without referring them to the Secretary of State?
Well, it would depend what they were. But, you know, in every department, in every department, most people might be worth pointing out, there are 3 tiers in every department: Secretary of State, Minister of State, and Parliamentary Under Secretary of State. And it would depend, obviously, on the size of the department, how many people at each of those levels there were. But these kind of issues didn't really work, were not a problem in health because of the close relationship between Kenneth Clarke and I. So I could do pretty much what I wanted, but obviously I would always, on policy matters, defer to him. But I would occasionally, as you can see as you go through the documents, refer matters to him because he was extremely busy as well, and I wanted to make sure he had the opportunity to comment on things that I thought were either problematic or were going to become problematic.
Something which you say in your statement is that one of your roles was to ensure that the Secretary of State was never blindsided by an issue.
Yes, I think that's very important. It wasn't true of all the ministers in our department, but I took that duty very seriously, yes.
Was there any set criteria for what should go up to the Secretary of State, or was it a judgment call on your part?
No, I think it was, the Secretary of State would be copied in, his office would be copied in, so it wasn't just my judgment. It would be the judgment of his private office. And again, I don't know how much of this has ever, you know, because a lot of people outside of Whitehall wouldn't necessarily know this, but to be a private secretary to a minister was regarded in the civil service as a major appointment and a signpost to bigger things to come. So the head of the private office, certainly for a Secretary of State, but also for a Minister of State, was a very significant post, and everybody in the private office, and there would usually be 3, 4, 5, 6. To give you an example, the late Jeremy Hayward, who sadly died while he was in office as the head of the civil service, he was my principal private secretary when I was Chief Secretary of the Treasury. And so a man of that quality to have as your principal private secretary shows the importance that the civil service attached to, first of all, getting the best people to serve in private offices, but secondly, that those people were given the experience of being in a minister's private office, which means they're not any longer just dealing with fairly narrow issues. They see across the board. So I also mention that because when people see these documents, they see a whole list of people that are being copied in. Now, more of those people would be private secretaries of one kind or another, and it was their job to pre-digest a lot of this stuff, because the system can only work if there are plenty of people breaking down the issues. Because I was, probably because I didn't have much of a life, I used to do a lot of work on my boxes. I'm sure there were more exciting ways of spending one's time. But the point is, I might do 2 or 3 boxes a night, but even that wasn't enough unless you had somebody saying, no, he doesn't need to see this, no, he doesn't need to see that. And so much depended on having the right people in your private office who instinctively knew what a minister had to see and who knew what was just there as stuff that was, okay, important to somebody, but wasn't important enough to go up the line. It's a hierarchical structure, you know, with a whole raft of civil servants, all structured according to the levels that they have reached, and sitting on top of that or alongside it or wherever, depending how cynical people are about ministers, sitting there are the ministers.
In your statement, you addressed a question that was asked of you by the inquiry about how effective that process was in ensuring that the Minister of State was suitably informed about key issues. You said, and I quote, "I have no reason to think the process was not effective and do not recall having any concerns about this process."
Are you quoting from my statement?
It's paragraph 2.4.
Paragraph 2.4, yeah.
So, I have no reason to think the process was not effective and do not recall having any concerns about this process at the time.
No, I was, I mean, some ministers made a habit of falling out with their civil servants. They thought it was a sign of sort of virility, or whatever the female equivalent of virility is, to fall out with. I had the best relationships with most of the civil servants I worked with. I admired them. I admired their incredible energy. You know, they would arrive first thing in the morning and leave last thing at night. I mean, poor old Jeremy Hayward, he would sit there for about 15 hours puffing away at his cigarettes, which didn't actually do him a lot of good in the long run. But this was sheer dedication. So I had a lot of respect for them, and it would be unusual for people who put in that amount of effort for them not to have worthwhile things to say. And of course, what mattered was what was their judgment on what they read. And generally speaking, I felt in 6 departments I served in, I was extremely well served.
How did health compare to those other departments?
Well, it's not as good, obviously, as high-powered as the Treasury. I mean, I was lucky, really, because the 3 big departments of state, the Home Office, as it then was before the division with Justice, the Foreign Office, and the Treasury, I mean, those are serious departments. I think the Department of Health would not, I think, be regarded as one of the creme de la creme. But as I say, I thought that we were very well served. And what matters in the Department of Health was the quality of the advice you got, not so much on what I would call ministerial matters, but on health issues. And that's where I had great support from Donald Atchison, and from, I gather, he's also no longer with us, Dr. Metters and people like that, who were, I mean, first-class people. And, you know, I was always very aware of the fact that I could not make medical judgments, or rather, anyone who asked me to make a medical judgment was nuts. I could make judgments about political issues, I could make judgments about administrative issues, but I never hesitated to sit down with the specialists. And that's why, as I say to you, I spent most of the time that I had meeting people in department, meeting the technical people, because you know, they were usually very good, very well motivated, and they could tell me things that I didn't know, and if I didn't know, I wasn't going to get them right. We
have heard at the inquiry a fair bit of evidence about the dual hierarchy of the medical civil service and the administrative civil service. Building on what you've just said there, do you think that was an effective way of running the department?
Well, I don't see how else you could do it, you see. I mean, I'm quite shocked, actually. Maybe it's old age creeping on. You mentioned the name of the permanent secretary. I can't remember him at all. Isn't that awful? Well, it was 30 years ago. Give me his name again.
Sir Christopher French.
Right, I don't.
Sorry, Sir Christopher France.
No, I don't remember him at all. But I do remember a lot of the technical people, because I would sit with them and insist that they enlightened me, and then I could take what I hope was a brave decision when it needed to be taken. I mean, this is irrelevant to what you're thinking about, but in cochlear implants, I remember sitting down with the doctors in the department, one or two of them, and saying, I'm being advised. Jack Ashley, who was a very dear friend of mine, who was a Labour MP, he went profoundly deaf during the course of his service, and cochlear implants had helped him regain some kind of hearing. And I remember reading the brief from the civil servants that said, you know, you can't accept this. And I spoke to one or two of the doctors, and halfway through the meeting, I just shut the file and said, Jack, I can't say no to you, and I'm not going to. So that was the value. But you see, if the medical people were integrated into the department, they would become subject to the same pressures. You know, the job of a civil servant is basically to try to ensure that the government doesn't take on too much, and in particular, that they don't break their spending limits. So I don't blame the people on cochlear implants that they didn't want me to do it. But at a certain point, you have to say, this change is bigger than the narrow worries about how much it costs. And I felt that on a number of occasions in what we're dealing with, for instance, settling on the AIDS cases. And you know, I thought it'd be awful to force people to go to court over getting proper compensation. And I was always very keen. And in fact, we ended up, I think, when I was at the Treasury, accepting a settlement of 45, 47 million. That was this figure that came up from the council to the people who had been so gravely affected by this. It wasn't an imposed figure from the Treasury.
We'll come back onto the settlement in
Yeah.
due course. At the top of that hierarchy, and as you've referred to already, there was the chief medical officer.
Yes.
In your time, Sir Donald Aitchison, and you've referred to Dr. Jeremy Metters as well,
Yes.
who held various posts but became deputy chief medical officer,
Yes.
I think, during your time as at the
He
department.
did, yes.
How did you understand the role of the chief medical officer and his deputies?
Well, their job was to provide expert advice because they were qualified. I mean, Donald Aitchison could go and speak at any gathering anywhere in the world, and people would say, "Who's he? You're just some fellow who muddles around in the Department of Health." He would be regarded as an expert on a whole range of things. And it would take a great deal to persuade me not to agree with them, because I had respect for him and affection, actually.
You've said that you spent quite a lot of time with him. Was that regular time, a set meeting each week? Or
We were just down the corridor. I would just wander in, and he'd sigh deeply, and we'd have a chat. Yeah.
Did you understand it to be the role of a chief medical officer to offer advice to doctors throughout the country on, for example, how to treat patients with haemophilia?
Well, that was an interesting point. There were occasions when I took the view that when you've got a good CMO, he should do more than ministers, because we had instances, and I'm desperately trying to recall one to mind now, but where advice had to be given to the public. And I thought, what's the point of me, or indeed one or two of my colleagues, giving advice to the public? The advice to the public about what they should do in order to minimize their chances of catching something or spreading something should come from a doctor. And Donald Aitchison was very happy to take on board that. And, I don't think that it was his role just to advise behind the scenes. I thought he should become more upfront, because why would anyone ignore what he had to say? But plenty of people were only too willing to ignore what I had to say.
From what you're saying then, how you're describing it there, it seems that you were somebody who pushed that forward within the department, and perhaps it hadn't been there before. Is that a correct interpretation?
No, I think Ken was probably in favour of all of that. But by the time I arrived at the Department of Health, I had been a junior or middle-ranking minister. I'm just trying to work it out, for 10 years. I mean, if you don't learn a bit one then, the trouble these days is a lot of people, they don't remain ministers for any time at all. They're shipped in and they're shipped out. But being a minister is itself a skill set, and understanding the issues, it requires quite a lot of effort. But once you think you're on top of them, you do develop work practices. And I always took the view that one should go and deal with particularly the technical people. And it never embarrassed me to admit that I wasn't initially able to make much of a contribution. Some people are frightened of admitting that they don't really know very much, whereas it's always come easily to me.
Just finally on this question of the dual hierarchy and the CMO, the inquiries heard some evidence, but there were some concerns about this, perhaps external to the department, and about the risk of the experts being on top rather than being on tap. Was that a concern that you had, either at the time or subsequently?
Absolutely not.
Moving on then briefly to the question of the territorial departments, the Department for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. At 2.6 in your statement on page 8, you say that, and I quote, I think it is unlikely that I personally would have had interactions with the Welsh office, the Scottish office, the Scottish Home and Health Department of the Northern Ireland office on these issues related to matters the inquiry is concerned with, when I was Minister of State for Health, and you also note that there's no suggestion of this from the documents that you have seen. First of all, does that remain your evidence?
Yes, absolutely. This was, again, one of those things. I'm sure it would be nice to go and have a little bit of whiskey with my Scottish equivalent, but, there wasn't the time.
Can you remember how, if at all, those departments influenced health policy at the Department of Health?
No, I can't. Because don't forget, one of the reasons why we have this raft of civil servants and private secretaries is they would be expected to consult with the territorial departments and take on board what they had to say. But I think there was one instance where I think one of my more amiable colleagues, the Secretary of State for Scotland, got annoyed with me because I was trying to demand that he absorb the cost of what the lawyers had cost. And he didn't like me for that. But I can count on the fingers of one hand where we fell out. It's just that, I did not regard liaising with the territorial departments as a key element of my role, or indeed as an element of my role. I would assume that the civil servants, where the time they had met together, would have come up with united advice. And if there was any conflict, that would have been drawn to my attention. But I don't think there was. I think, reading through the documents again, I think Ian Lang, was it not, Ian Lang,
yes,
got across with me about demanding that the lawyers were paid for by them. Well,
We'll come on to that later. That's to do with the HIV litigation settlement. Let's move then to the question of, in general terms, of AIDS and of responsibility for the AIDS portfolio and the blood products portfolio. You've said already, and you say in your statement, paragraph 2.2, there's no need to bring it up, that the responsibility for blood and blood products lay with the junior ministers. The responsibility for dealing with AIDS more generally lay with you as Minister of State.
Yes.
How were those responsibilities decided?
The Secretary of State would decide. After consultation, he asked me what I wanted to do, and generally he gave me all that I wanted. Because once again, you need to bear in mind that, you don't, but other people do, you know this already. Think about a minister. A minister, first of all, is a member of Parliament, and it is wise to retain an active interest in his constituency. A minister is also a voting member of the House of Commons. Now, these days, they have it easy. They start in the mornings and they finish in the early evening. We used to sit through the night very regularly. So you'd arrive in a department to make complex decisions completely shattered. And then there was the work of being a minister, which, as I say, generally I enjoy. Dear Mrs. Thatcher, with whom I had quite an in-and-out relationship, it is a privilege to serve, she said. Well, I always tried to regard it in that way. But, she's right in the sense, but the trouble was that quite often you were making decisions that it would have been nice to have had all week to make that one decision, and of course you never had that time. That was when you lent on the experience of your civil servants to be able to point you in the right direction. I didn't mean they made up my mind, but there were ones that you thought were particularly good, and you would want to know what they thought, and there'd have to be a good reason to disagree with them. And what I always took the view in my time as a minister, you wanted esprit de corps. You wanted people to believe that they were a key element and work as a team and take a view that what the team did mattered to them as individuals. It wasn't just, some pathetic old minister making a mess of it all at the top of the tree.
Did that approach extend to your ministerial colleagues as well as to the civil servants?
Well, I think they must speak for themselves. You'll hear, no doubt, from Mrs. Curry, who will have her own unique take on all of this.
Was there any supervisory role for you as Minister of State for Health, supervising the work that was being done by the parliamentary undersecretaries?
No, I think that would... and it wasn't really necessary. I don't want to... she did her job, and I rarely... No one came to me and said, she's not doing her job. She did her job. Just that her outlook on life was rather different to mine, whereas my outlook on life was very similar to that of Ken Clarke, in effect.
And what about Roger Freeman?
Well, Roger's a very good fellow, and he remains a good friend of mine. But I can't remember when he came in, but a lot of the heavy lifting was done before that. But Roger is A, bright, B, experienced, and C, non-confrontational, and D, not irritating. So he was a good fat man to have a look, sit alongside.
He replaced Mrs. Curry in December 1988.
No, it can't. Are we sure about that?
I think Mrs. Curry's we can check over the break, but Mrs. Curry's resignation, I think, was December 1988.
Anyway, I remember the circumstances of her resignation, but I can't remember the date of it. Anyway, I would not play any part in supervising them. I had enough on my plate without doing that.
Would you have regular meetings of the ministerial?
Oh, yes. The ministerial team in every properly run department would have what in some department is known as prayers, where you would gather together first thing in the morning, sometimes every day, departments like the Home Office. I mean, if you had to sit in a collegiate gathering and understand what was going on and trying to make sure that everybody... I remember one gathering in the Home Office, and suddenly we heard what sounded like a rifle shot, and of course it was that poor WPC being shot out of the Libyan embassy just across the park. So yeah, I mean, you know, it was very, very important for ministers to meet together and to know each other.
A question which has been raised by a number of the call participants is whether or not there were any difficulties caused by the fact that the blood and blood products sat with one minister, the brief for blood and blood products sat with one minister, whereas the brief for AIDS more generally sat with you. To the best of your recollection, did that cause any tensions or any difficulties or any lack of communication?
I don't think so, because it would be obvious, as you know, you've been through all the documents. I did quite a lot on the blood, take an interest in the blood products issue. But what I couldn't do was some of the assessments that had to be made that I just didn't have time for. I mean, the core of this tragedy was buying blood products from overseas, and the core of this tragedy was the commercial trade in blood products inevitably meant that blood products, certainly in America, tended to come from, how does one say this, some of the more impoverished sections of the community where there would be added potential for the blood to be contaminated. And it was the failure to appreciate in time that the blood products were contaminated that led to a lot of this. Now, I did not, the assessment of all of that was not something I would have had, I couldn't really expand to, but I'm satisfied that every effort was made by all concerned, and it was simply that technology lagged behind reality.
On the general AIDS brief, I'd like to ask you a few questions about that, so not specific to blood and blood policy, but to the wider work that you did as Minister of State. You say, and again, this doesn't need to be brought up, but it's 2.3 of your statement, that among your responsibilities was working with the Health Education Authority on public health campaigns. Now, just so that we are clear, you came into this post after the Don't Die of Ignorance or the Tombstone campaign.
Norman Fowler set that and did a very brave job on that.
I'd like, if I may, to just show you an extract of some of your evidence to the Social Services Committee of the House of Commons. It's right. WITN 706-8002. We can see that this is the report of the Social Services Committee, a report which is on AIDS. It's from the 1988 to 1989 session, and if we go down a little bit further, please, we can see that it's ordered to be printed on the 21st of June 1989. But for our purposes, the relevant section is at electronic page 12. We can see just at the top of that page that there is a transcript of the evidence that was given by you, by Sir Donald Aitchison, and by Mr. Alan Barton, an Assistant Secretary of the AIDS Unit, to the committee in the course of its work. That evidence appears to be dated the 8th of February 1989. Now, I'm not going to go through it all, but having read it, I can say that the evidence that you gave covered the following ground, and I say this as an illustration of the type of work that you would have been conducting as Minister of State, but with the caveat that, of course, you were responding to the questions that were asked of you, rather than setting out from scratch everything that you did, so it's not going to be comprehensive. But the areas that you were asked about included community care for people with AIDS and the department's role in organising, funding and providing training for that community care, the role of GPs and family planning clinics in providing AIDS treatment, funding and monitoring of voluntary organisations dealing with AIDS, allocation and monitoring of funding to regional health authorities for AIDS-related work, how to obtain data on infection rates, issues over anonymous testing, the approach to children with AIDS, including in respect of schooling, wider public education campaigns, AIDS education in schools. You were also asked about AIDS in prison, but you and your officials deferred that matter to the Home Office. Is that indicative of at least some of the issues?
Yes, and it's useful you read it out because it just shows, it's a AIDS problem was a many-headed monster, and there was and each one of the things you've read out required quite delicate consideration. And I remember giving the figures, including, I think, 40% of infection rate in Belgium of active homosexuals, because one of the things that we never knew, and I don't think it was known for some considerable time afterwards, was whether it would become a pandemic or whether it would be confined to a relatively limited section of the community. Now, in Africa, AIDS is much more of a heterosexual transmitted disease than a homosexual transmitted disease, or one transmitted by the share of needles amongst drug addicts. Happily, for whatever reason, it would appear, though long after my time, that it wasn't as readily transmissible amongst the heterosexual population in this country as it was in Africa. But I think what people need to understand, I mean, we hear all about pandemics now, in relation to an altogether, I mean, I don't want to underestimate the problems posed by COVID, but I mean, in the great history of pandemics, it's not one of the worst, whereas AIDS had the potential to be really one of the worst.
And at that stage, 1988, 1989, is it the case that it was not clear what the direction of travel would be?
No, it was not clear, and I was looking at that. You kindly dug out an interview I gave to a local paper.
We can bring that up on screen if that would help.
Yes, and...
R-lit 301613. It's very difficult to read. You've been provided.
And it was interesting to read that because that expressed what the situation was as clearly as I could explain it at that moment. And
thank you.
You see, penultimate paragraph, I say, and a cure, the interviewer says.
If we could just pause for a moment, Mr. Mellor, we'll just bring that section up on screen. I'm afraid it's not particularly easy to read on the screen, but Mr. Mellor has been provided with a transcript.
Well, I think read it slowly, if you're going to read it, so that those who are watching online can follow.
Okay. So, and a cure, banging clenched fists onto his knees for emphasis. He, that's me, answers, quotes, absolutely none. About that, one has to be most categoric. There is no prospect of a vaccine for as far ahead as we can see. The best is some drugs which will prolong life. It's a point one has to continually ram home. Yes, it's depressing. The medical profession never expected a virulent epidemic of a kind that medical science couldn't adjust to. One that is so cruel, it just strikes with its awful symptoms, and there is just no hope of a cure. One must try not to get depressed about that, but we must constantly remind people about this horrible disease. One just has to do the best one can. Now, I don't think there was any element of exaggeration of that. Happily, things are much better now. But at the time that we're speaking of, the potential of the AIDS epidemic to cause devastation in different parts of the world was not, we were incapable of understanding just how bad it was going to get. But the best assumption was to assume that it could get very bad. And that was why we often had a lively debate, say, for instance, with the then Prime Minister, that our job was not to sort of preach to people. Our job was to offer practical advice about how to avoid getting AIDS. And that was that was controversial, both with her and with quite a number of Conservative backbenchers, I'm sure Labour backbenchers as well, because they wanted some sense of moral indignation about AIDS, which I never felt able to bring to the party myself. It was a condition that people got. The question is, how do you then prevent more people getting it? The answer is you invite people to change their habits.
You say that there was often a lively debate with the Prime Minister, then Mrs. Thatcher. Did that debate with her, and indeed with others, hamper the work that you were doing on AIDS?
I don't think so, because generally speaking, to be fair to her, she would harumph a bit about this, that, and the other. But generally speaking, we could handle her. Because don't forget, Norman Fowler was a master at handling Margaret Thatcher. And Ken Clarke, although he annoyed her, as did I, was equally quite good. But if you said to me what was the most stressful part of being Minister of Health, it was having to deal with the Prime Minister on the subject of AIDS, and even more so on the subject of health service reform. And, you felt pretty exhausted at the end of that, and you have to go back and go through a couple of boxes of documents, but there you are.
How about ministerial colleagues, both in the Department of Health and in the Cabinet? What was their attitude?
I can't really remember now. I guess there would be a full range of opinions. But generally speaking, I think the Cabinet was pretty united on all of that. And certainly there were no shortage of people who put their hands on my arms and say, I'm glad I'm not doing your job.
If we could go back to the... before we do so, I've been helpfully reminded that the transcript is on relativity. The references are lit 301621. That's the transcript of that article, should people need to refer to it in the future. If we could go back, please, to the evidence that you gave to the Select Committee in the House of Commons. And if we could have WITN 7068002 and page 18. And if we could just highlight the first column from paragraph 32 onwards. This is a point.
Can I have that narrowed down, please? Yeah.
Yes.
It's arrived.
I'll read it through to you very slowly as well. This is about one of the issues that you raised there, and the idea of stigmatisation of those who had AIDS.
Yes.
The approach that the government should be taking to it. You were asked a question by the chair of the committee, who was Frank Field, and this is about children with AIDS, and it's this. Is not this a particularly important area, Minister? Because with children falling over, fighting, biting, spitting, the rest of it, parents themselves would be very worried, would they not, about cross-infection in schools? And therefore, to know about the numbers and then to ask you about what sort of advice you were giving to the Department of Education and Science on this would be of interest to them as well as to the committee. Your answer was this. I'm not suggesting that it is not important. I think it's interesting, and of course, it is one of the most desperately troubling parts of the whole thing. I think AIDS is a terrible thing, whoever it strikes, but I cannot help feeling that it is particularly desperate when it strikes young children. I can assure you that we are giving a great deal of thought to that, not least the question, which is also true of adult people with AIDS in the workplace, as to where you draw the line. One of the things we think is very important is that it is not just important that people should know how you get AIDS, but also how you do not get AIDS, so that one does not have the growing up of lepers within our society, people who are shunned as pariahs. And there are one or two horrendous cases in the United States about young children being subjected to the most awful treatment. God knows that they have been given a difficult enough hand of cards as it is without suffering from what is really vile and base prejudice. So we are interested in this, and indeed Donald, that's Sir Donald Aitchison, might like to talk about this subject. You are then asked a question by the Conservative backbench MP Nicholas Winterton.
Yes.
Who says,
Don't ask my opinion of Nicholas Winterton.
I will come on to that in a second.
I
Mr.
might lose
Winterton,
whatever composure I've got. Yeah, go on.
Mr. Winterton says, can I develop this to put a specific question? Certainly cases have come to our attention from the United States where youngsters who have contracted AIDS through no fault of their own have been excluded from school. And you say, yes, that's right. This may be a reference to the case of Ryan White in the United States.
Well, that's quite a good question for Nick Winterton. I should take it back, beyond the grave. That's a good question.
Then he asks, how are we going to deal with that? Because it could well happen even here in the United Kingdom. And so Donald Aitchison replies, perhaps I could answer the first question and then the second. Mr. Chairman, there is no evidence of any case, so far as I am aware, where a child has infected another child through any type of contact which takes place at school. I would like to make it absolutely clear that the advice we receive from experts is that there is no risk of cross-infection from a child who is infected with HIV at school, provided various simple precautions are taken, which have been issued to all schools. I'll skip over the next question from the chairman, and a further question from Mr. Winterton, who says, 36 in the second column. Thank you. What about physical games, Sir Donald? Certainly rugby football, ordinary association football, hockey. People can be injured, blood can be drawn. This clearly is a very sensitive area. What advice are you giving in respect of young people who have HIV infection participating in physical games at school? Sir Donald Aitchison answers, the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, which gives advice to the government on the medical aspects of AIDS, has currently got a group looking at this very point. The starting point is that there is a risk in relation to games and contact. That if there is a risk in relation to games and contact games, it is very small indeed. But I would not wish to prejudge what they will find, and we are expecting their report very soon. You then say, I think it would be the case, though, Donald, that in relation to adults playing games of that kind, there is not evidence of transmission in that way. So Donald says, exactly. Again, we start from really looking at a theoretical risk. I am not aware of any proven cases of transmission, either in rugby football, boxing, or any of these things. But nevertheless, people are concerned about this, and we are putting guidance together.
Yeah, well, I think that again, is helpful for two reasons. First of all, what I think will have come across is the warmth of the relationship between Donald Aitchison and myself, and how much stronger we are as a team than giving evidence independently. And there was never any problem about working out what he should answer, what I should answer. The whole idea being to show a united front. The other interesting thing for which we have to thank Norman Fowler, the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, were a distinguished bunch, and we would take their advice. However, you wouldn't have any one of them popping up on breakfast radio or breakfast television contradicting each other and having the 15 minutes of fame that Andy Warhol promised all of us by saying things over and above what they were asked to advise on. I mean, when the history, and I hopefully won't live that long, when the history of this current pandemic is written, one of the things that will surely come across as dreadful is the mayhem of various voices, each claiming to be a member of the advisory committee on that, contradicting each other and doing their best to wind people up. Our job was to tell people the truth, but it wasn't to have a lot of motley crew of people contradicting each other. We had to give the impression, it was a true impression, that the government had taken the voices and the government had formed a view, and that was the right view, and people could believe the credibility of that view. And I don't think there's, looking back over this, as much that we said 30-odd years ago that hasn't actually turned out to be, in the history of predictions, pretty good. If that does sound complacent, it's mainly other people I'm praising, but I don't think we got a lot of things wrong. If we'd followed certain siren voices to denounce gay people or to try to totally prevent drug misuse. I mean, that would have been an exercise in futility, and we were strong about that, always.
When you say we, you're referring to yourself, the CMO, and others within
No,
the
and
Department
others,
of Health.
people like Norman Farr, people. I mean, there was a strong. It was a strong group of people, and forget about me, but one of the problems with politics is someone like, I don't know, you heard from Norman Fowler. Whether the Norman Fowlers of this world go into politics anymore, because he was a master of calm, good sense, and really knocked into shape the government's response to that. So long after he left the field, we were still following what he had to say.
Just one thing to pick up from Nicholas Winston's initial question. He said that he was referring to youngsters who had contracted AIDS through no fault of their own. Whether intentionally or otherwise, that may suggest a distinction between innocent victims of AIDS and people who had somehow...
I'm glad you proved to me why my scepticism about Nicholas Winterton was appropriate. But Nick Winterton was like that. I mean, probably nobody had the privilege of meeting him. He was a big... any china shop who needed a bull, Nick was always there.
Was your view, or let me put it neutrally, I think we can discern the answer from what you've said already, but how did you consider that supposed distinction between those who had brought it upon themselves and those who were innocent?
It was totally without any merit whatsoever. You can't be judgmental about what people do. I mean, I used to travel a lot to New York in the late 80s, and the bathhouse culture and all of that. And perhaps it was inevitable that something would come out of that wouldn't be very helpful. But there's really no point in saying, well, of course, you've only got yourselves to blame. What you do is you find people who've got a problem and you try and help, A, them, B, others, to try and say, look, the best way to ensure that you don't get AIDS is not to share needles, not to have unprotected anal sex, all of that stuff. And for me, well, maybe it'll prove different. I don't believe any of us at that period indulge in empty moralizing, of which I have very little time in government, and particularly very little time in this instance.
I'm going to move now to the question of the McFarlane Trust.
Ah, yes.
We're going to look together at a series of documents about some concerns that were raised about the McFarlane Trust and how it was spending the money that it had been granted by the government. It begins, we go to paragraph 3.4 of your statement. If we could bring that up, page 11. Sorry, WITN 7068001, page 11. I'm going to use your summary rather than going to the document itself, but for the record, the document is HSOC 0013432. In your statement, you summarise it this way. On the 9th of October 1988, the Sunday Times published an article entitled AIDS Victims Dying Before Trust Pays Up. It was stated in the article that nearly a year after the government pledged £10 million for a trust fund to help haemophiliacs with the AIDS virus, only £132,000 had been paid out. The article highlighted the passage of time between the announcement of the government grant in November 1987 and the trust being formed in March 1988, and suggested that trustees had only just agreed a policy to allocate payments. It also suggested that few haemophiliacs were expected to qualify for regular support from the trust. I was referenced in the article in the following terms, quotes, David Mellor, the health minister, last night said he would investigate the delays, end quotes.
Yes.
So that is the article on the 8th of October 1988. We will look at the documents that were produced following your investigation into the issue. Can I just ask this before we do? What responsibility or formal responsibility did you have as Minister of State for the McFarlane Trust?
Oh, I mean, first of all, the McFarlane Trust was independent, but I took a great deal of interest in this, and in fact, following on these various concerns, I asked officials for a full briefing about it, and I also spoke to Kenneth Clarke about it, and we were both extremely concerned at how slowly they were paying out. I then put in what I thought was a good structural reform, which was to get a report every 2 months of what they had been doing. And also, we made it clear that if there was, that they shouldn't worry about running out of money. What they should worry about is spending money inappropriately. And we were never, for instance, in favour of them giving people money in order to pay lawyers, bless their hearts, to sue the department. You know, if they had a case, they could get that through legal aid. But essentially what we were trying to do was to say, if there is a reason for spend the money. And I also remember saying a bit down the track that when they got within 2 to 3 years of spending all the money, they should then put in for some more. I never believed that 10 million was enough. I never believed that 10 million was going to do the trick. But what I was insistent upon was that what we were trying to do was alleviate some of the costs of being a family that was living with AIDS, and that we were looking to provide some of the wherewithal needed, the additional cost of having to do that.
Just going back to the start of your answer there, you say that the trust was independent, and we will see from documents how that played out. But that you, as Minister of State, took an interest in it. So am I right in thinking it wasn't a formal position, but it was one that, as Minister of State, you could make these requests, for example, for reports?
Well, this was one of those issues I referred to Kenneth Clarke, and we agreed that the trust should be encouraged to make payments when they deemed it appropriate to do so, not to change the basis of what were the reasons why they paid out, which is why I quoted this business about seeking legal advice. If somebody thought that they had a claim against the department, the government, whomsoever, then there was a legal aid fund available to do that. But what they were not to do was to be worried that because there's only 10 million, you know, they might originally want to help 50 people, but they felt they could only help 25 because of running out of money. I never thought that 10 million was ever going to be enough, and it wasn't, of course.
Let's look at a couple of the documents where this plays out. If we could begin, please, with DHSC 303303_005. You refer to this at paragraph 3.5 of your statement.
Yes. Can someone just scroll up to 3.5?
We'll bring the document up on the screen. I see you have the statement next to you, should you
yes, I
need to
do,
refer to it. Paragraph 3.5, page 11.
Yeah.
Just looking at the document, I should say that several of these documents haven't been shown previously at the inquiry. For those who are following the inquiry's proceedings, we will bring them up on screen so that they can see the original as well as your comments on it. This is a document dated 13th of October 1988 from Dr. Roger Moore, sent to Ms. Harper, who I believe was one of your private secretaries.
Yes. She was my senior private secretary.
We can see at paragraph 1, MSH, the Minister of State for Health, so you, has asked for a note on the McFarlane Trust and the delay in paying potential beneficiaries alleged in the Sunday Times on the 9th of October. So that's why the note's being produced. Just before we leave this page, we can see the handwriting on the top there. Is that your handwriting?
No, I wish I wrote as clearly as that.
If
it's a doctor's handwriting, that's extraordinary, because there are few groups of people whose handwriting is worse than mine. I imagine that was probably Miss Harper's.
I think from the signature underneath it may well have been, and so a civil servant rather than a doctor, which may explain the handwriting. If we go to the second page of this document, please, and from paragraph 7, Dr. Moore had summarised the background, and he had pointed out that the trust had 10 trustees, 6 appointed by the Haemophilia Society and 4 appointed by the government.
Yeah.
And then he referred to the trust's initial work in trying to find and contact beneficiaries or potential beneficiaries. Paragraph 7, what Dr. Moore wrote is this, and I quote, "It was never intended that the 10 million should be compensation. The trust is a charity, and the trust deed restricts it to providing relief for those who are in need of assistance. Payments have been made from December 1987 by the Haemophilia Committee of the by the Haemophilia Society on behalf of the Macfarlane Trust. The Allocations Committee of the Macfarlane Trust has dealt with applications since June 1988. So far, 350 applications have been received and 297 payments have been made, totalling £132,000. That's the figure quoted in the Sunday Times article. Back to the document. The largest single grant was just over £3,000. Some applicants clearly thought that they were entitled to compensation, and unless they could demonstrate need, have not been given a grant. The allocation policy has developed in response to applications received. It is the intention primarily to make regular payments to those on low income, as well as single payments for specific items. The Trust has adopted a cautious maximum regular payment of £20 per week, subject to a means test. This amount will be reviewed when the Trust have more idea of the number of dependents who might need help over a long period. They are also investigating how best to help with mortgages and life insurance." If we turn now, please, to your response to that document, which is WITN 07588023. This is dated the 25th of October 1988, and it is a minute sent from Miss Harper to Dr. Moore.
Yes.
And it says, "Thank you for your minute of the 13th of October. The Minister of State for Health is content to leave matters as they are for present. However, he has commented that his personal view is that the Trust is being overcautious in its approach."
Yes.
And I think that you've explained your concerns about overcaution in the evidence that you've just given.
Yes.
Why were you, at that stage, content to leave matters as they were?
I don't know what that really meant. It was her words, not mine. But I think that that one always had to remember that we were not supposed to be telling the Trust what to do. But I would have expected my opinions, particularly since they were shared by Kenneth Clarke, to be passed over. But it was not my job to tell the Trust what to do. But what we tried to do was to reassure them that there would be more money for appropriate reasons. Now, what was an inappropriate reason would be for people who thought that this was about compensation. It could be about compensation, but that's a different area altogether. What this was about was trying to ensure that the necessary expenses that came about because of a member of the family had AIDS was something that they could be paid a supplementary income to help them deal with it. Although even for 30 years ago, the sums involved are quite small.
I'm not going to go through all of the subsequent documents, but we can see from your statement and the documents referred to in it that Mr. Clarke was provided with a note along the same lines as the one that went to you. And in response to that, he asked the relevant document. I don't ask for it to be brought onto the screen. The relevant document for the record is WITN 0758025. He asked 4 questions.
Yeah.
Why has only £132,000 been paid out? What plans do the Treasury have? Does the Trust have for the £10 million? How long does the Trust expect the sum to last? And what did Mr. Newton, so the predecessor, say that the intention of the Trust was? and he asks for answers as soon as possible. Would you agree that that's a more interventionist approach from the one that
Well, he's the Secretary of State.
You've preempted my next question.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not my job to make him feel small in his own department. Besides, I didn't need to. Ken Clarke and I would meet almost every evening after work, possibly even having a glass of something, if I'm brutally honest with you. And we got on incredibly well. I didn't need to try and push him around. And, I knew what he thought, and he told them what he thought. And it wasn't for me to pretend I was the Secretary of State, doing things that a Secretary of State can do with much more authority.
Was there anything in Mr. Clarke's approach that you disagreed with?
No. I mean, I gather he got a bit irritated with all of you when he came, but we must blame that on Ken and old age and his arthritis playing him up. But he was extremely supportive of everything that I thought. Now, maybe what I thought was as wrong as maybe some people thought what he thought, but he was a model of a sympathetic person to work with and work under. And, the best Secretary of State when I was a junior minister I really worked with.
I'm going to take you to the response to those questions, which is at DHSC 0020286. It's also something that you refer to at paragraph 3.15 of your statement, if you want to have that to hand. We can see this is a minute from the 17th of November 1988, sent to the part of the Private Secretary of the Secretary of State and also to Miss Harper. And we can see in the copy list.
And indeed to the PS to Edwina Curry, if it was still her at that time, yeah.
The answers given to the questions, why has only £132,000 been paid out of the 10 million? The answer is the trust was only established in March 1988. The initial priority of the trustees was to contact all potential beneficiaries to establish a likely level of demand whilst formulating an allocation policy. The amount paid out necessarily began slowly but is now rising rapidly as more applications are received and dealt with. The current amount paid out is £200,000, which will double shortly as backdated payments are made to some beneficiaries. All applications need careful scrutiny. A fair number of fraudulent or unrealistic claims have been received. What plans do the Trust have for the £10 million? The trustees see the need to support dependents of those who die as a major call on the £10 million. They are investigating ways in which they can help with mortgage payments and life insurance. Meanwhile, they are increasing the number of beneficiaries receiving weekly maintenance payments and those being given lump sums for holidays, domestic appliances, etc.
See, and history repeats itself, first as a tragedy, second as a farce. When you look at that, what we say about what Dr. Moore says about the need to be careful about fraudulent claims, I mean, as one reads in the papers today, and it might nevertheless be true, that some of the money for alleviation of costs on the current pandemic ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda, you realize how necessary it is to be careful. And when you just allow money to be spent without what I would call rational checks, you end up with the scandals where an ex-minister can say £4.5 billion was probably fraudulently obtained and used. I mean, at some point, someone will have to pay the price for that.
If we just look at number 3 as well, just to complete this document, how long do the Trust expect the sum to last? What is written is, the trustees do not at present have any definite expectations, since they have not yet plumbed the total need. They are concentrating on meeting financial need, which they are interpreting as alleviating poverty. They are aware that their responsibility to dependents will remain for many years to come. They are responsibly husbanding their resources, since they are aware that the Trust might not get any more money from government.
Yeah.
I won't go into what Mr. Newton said. Now, as you say, and that's paragraph 3.18 and 3.19, you requested 2 monthly reports from the Trust in response. And a letter was sent to this effect by Dr. Moore on the 6th of December 1988. we could just have that on screen. DHSC 303311_012, please. This was sent to the Reverend Alan Tanner, the chairman of the trustees, on the 6th of December 1988, by Roger Moore on behalf of the department. In the letter, Dr. Moore said, "Ministers have expressed some concern at recent press reports which suggested that the Macfarlane Trust has not been distributing money as quickly as it should. We have been able to reassure them that the trustees have adopted a cautious and responsible approach and that the amount of money paid out will increase once a more complete picture of the need has been obtained. Nevertheless, the Minister of Health, Mr. Mellor, has asked me for regular 2-monthly reports starting in January 1989 on the activities of the Trust." And he asks for those to be sent. And he describes what those reports should contain. Is it right to read this letter as one in which you, as Minister of State for Health, are seeking to exert some pressure over a body which was, as you say, independent?
Well, that's a pejorative way of putting it, you know. When you're a
It wasn't
minister,
intended to be. It wasn't intended to be, so please explain how...
I mean, I just wanted them to feel that if they wanted to do more quickly, they would get a sympathetic ear.
The documents that we have seen so far suggest that the Trust was one of the reasons that the Trust was being cautious was because they had £10 million.
Yeah, they're worried they were going to run out of cash. Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
And ministers were concerned that as a result of this, they were being overly cautious in their approach, but without being able to give at that time a commitment to more money.
There were two. See, one explanation for slowness could be that, you know, they were worried about spending too much money. The other is simply bureaucratic inertia. You know, if I'd been setting up that trust, it wouldn't have as many trustees as it had because, you know, you'd want a small, much more activist group to do it. And I think the worry was that it was just inertia, some of it.
I appreciate that these weren't structures that
committees take minutes and waste years, yes, and that's what quite often happens.
These were structures that you inherited rather than structures that you had put in place.
I had nothing to do with that. Nor do I blame Tony Newton, who was an outstanding minister, let me say. But, you know, if I'd had my way, it would have been a smaller body and they would have had more confidence to get on with what they were doing. I mean, they were right to weed out certain things. And, you know, I can hardly be heard to say that I think the way that public money has been chucked around in this present pandemic and then condemn that and then say things that were done in our time to try and make sure that didn't happen were wrong. But I think there's, you know, there was room for a more speedy way of dealing with things. And I certainly, you know, as much as I could, with propriety, say, don't worry about the money, there will be more around if you need it.
While you say that you could say that wasn't anything that was contained in Dr. Moore's letter.
No, but then that's the difference, isn't it? I have no power. I wasn't Chief Secretary of the Treasury at that time. But what we were trying to do, and Ken Clarke was doing the same, was, you know, and that, I can't remember where it is, but there's a reference to when they're 2 to 3 years away from getting rid of the money that they've got, they should then make an application for more money.
We will come on to that document probably after the break.
Yeah.
But just before we do, does this suggest that there is a tension in that the trust was neither fish nor fowl, in the sense that it wasn't independent in the sense of having an independent revenue stream and could plan according to that revenue stream? It was reliant on government.
Well, it had a revenue
couldn't direct
stream.
What it was.
It had a revenue stream, but, you know, it's a compliment to the scale of the problem for some of us to think it wasn't enough, you know. And, you know, of course, it was increased, as we know.
it was increased in due course, but for the trustees in December 1988, the date of that letter, they couldn't with confidence conduct longer-term planning when they didn't know whether or not they would have more than £10 million. Is that fair?
Well, I think that they were encouraged to think that they should spend the money that they needed to spend if what they were doing was pursuing their core objectives, and then to ask for more.
As I say, the later documents where those discussions take place. So I note the time, and I wonder whether now might be a convenient point for a break.
Yes. Well, we'll take a break until 11:45. Now, Mr. Mellor, you've been in your early practice in court. You will have heard a judge say on a number of occasions, you're giving evidence, you must not talk to anyone about the evidence you're giving, or, for that matter, any evidence you expect you may be asked about. You can talk about anything else you like. That applies to you here, it applies at every break.
Thank you.
11:45.